This course contains recitations of the Quran in a secular context.
I've explored in earlier lectures the presence and role of Adam and Eve, Satan, Abraham, and Moses in the Quran. But there is a much longer list of characters familiar from the Bible who are also detailed in the Quran. Noah, Lot, Isaac and Ishmael, Joseph, Job, Jonah, Elijah and Elisha, David and Solomon, King Saul, and John the Baptist. And this list is not exhaustive. On top of these biblical figures, there are a number of figures often called the Arabian prophets, as they have no clear connection to either Jewish or Christian figures. Hud, Saleh, and Shu'aib. In this lecture, we'll explore some of these additional characters and their role in the Quran. I'll emphasize two figures that deserve paramount attention, Jesus and his mother Mary, along with the relatively more minor but still important figures of Noah and Joseph. However, all of these characters pale in comparison to the figure they were made to serve, God alone. What I mean, and what will become clear, is that no matter the textual prominence of the prophetic figures, either biblical or Arabian, their individual stories are all subservient to the principle of obedience to the divine. In fact, many of the details about Noah, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus that are unique to the Quran, those components not typically found in Jewish or Christian accounts of them, underscore the preeminence of God and God's will. No one, not Muhammad, not Jesus, can be thought of as in any way approaching the power and majesty of God. Let's begin with Noah and proceed in a chronological manner. Noah's story in the Quranic account closely follows the biblical narrative in most of its major details. God has lost patience with the depravity of early humankind, save for one righteous man and his family. That man, Noah, is ordered to build a giant ark, and on it house 2 of every animal, so that they and Noah's family will be safe from an apocalyptic flood God intends to unleash. There is, however, one key distinction in this story that departs from the biblical narrative. Just as he began to load the ark, Noah called out to his son who stayed away, "Come aboard with us, my son. Do not stay with the disbelievers." But he replied, "I will seek refuge on a mountain to save me from the water." Noah said, "Today there is no refuge from what God has commanded, except for those on whom he has mercy." The waves cut them off from each other, and he was among the drowned. While there's no hint of such tragedy in the biblical or midrashic texts, the dramatization of a lost son emphasizes a key Quranic theme. In the choice between familial ties and the Word of God, God's will always triumphs. Once the waters recede and the ark has settled on a mountain, Noah beseeches God, "My Lord, my son was one of my family, and your promise is true, and you are the most just of all judges." God said, "Noah, he was not one of your family. What he did was not right. Do not ask me for things you know nothing about. I am warning you not to be foolish." Although harsh, the message is clear. A new set of relationships has been established by God, and while they may tear apart the connections of blood, they reaffirm God's commitment to those who have accepted this warning. The Quranic narrative thus elevates the horror of the biblical story. Obedience to and trust in God is the only type of relationship that matters. This poses a distinct challenge to those relationships that were so critical in the 7th century, and remain so today, the connection to kith and kin, can often define our sense of social belonging and identity. Many of Muhammad's earlier followers were likewise torn between faith and family. But here, God rejects a notion of family based on blood and replaces it with righteousness. Sometimes, the tale of Noah tells us, adherence to God's will means losing those we love the most, though what we ostensibly gain is life itself. The story of Noah has interesting parallels to the Quranic story of Abraham that we examined in an earlier lecture. In both cases, the fathers speak with their sons just prior to the fulfillment of God's will, the flood for Noah and the sacrifice for Abraham. The difference, of course, is that Noah's son believes he can find his own refuge, while Abraham's son turns his trust over to his father and God. If we have in these stories contrasting representations of how to navigate between family and the divine, the story of Joseph offers a wholly different drama. Related with verve and detail in Surah 12, the story of Joseph being sold into bondage is the most elaborate narrative in the whole of the Quran. And once again, in nearly all details, the Quranic series of events closely parallels the biblical account. And, as always, it is the subtle differences that are key to appreciating the ethical and theological vision of the Quran. Following Joseph's enslavement in Egypt and paralleling the biblical account, his master's wife attempts to seduce him, but without success. In Genesis, the wife then hatches a plot to accuse Joseph of attempted rape, which lands him in jail. The Quranic version tells us that the husband sees evidence, a shirt torn from the back rather than the front, that implicates his wife in the seduction, and he accuses her of treachery. Surah 12 continues, "Some of the women of the city said, 'The governor's wife is trying to seduce her slave. Love for him consumes her heart. It is clear to us that she has gone astray.' When she heard their malicious talk, she prepared a banquet and sent for them, giving each of them a knife. She said to Joseph, 'Come out and show yourself to them.' And when the women saw him, they were stunned by his beauty and cut their hands, exclaiming, 'Great God, he cannot be mortal. He must be a precious angel.' So stunning was Joseph's beauty that the wife pleads her helplessness by parading Joseph in front of her friends, who in their rapture forget themselves and let the knives slice into their hands. This component of the story is unique, and its clever device of the neglected knife richly and succinctly captures the shock of seeing Joseph. But is that shock simply his physical beauty? Or is there something else afoot in this story? Although the text that follows this scene is somewhat confusing, it seems as if Joseph is only now put into jail, but mostly in order to protect him from the desire of the women, as well as save the master's wife from further temptation. In the end, they thought it best, after seeing all the signs of his innocence, that they should imprison him for a while. This peculiar rationale for imprisonment isn't simply dropped. Once Joseph's dream interpretation skills are made known to the king, Joseph asks that the women be called to testify in his defense. The king asked the women, "What happened when you tried to seduce Joseph?" They said, "God forbid, we know nothing bad of him." And the governor's wife said, "Now the truth is out. It was I who tried to seduce him. He is an honest man." No further mention is made of any of the women, but this episode fueled the imagination of later interpreters. In the interpretive tradition, the wife gets a name, Zuleika, and her desire for Joseph is refigured from simply physical lust to a desire for the divine righteousness Joseph so manifestly possessed. The women's comment that he is like a precious angel is read to mean that their collective desire was for the apparent glow of godly favor. And Zuleika's unrequited love is not treacherous and lustful, but instead symbolic of love for the divine, even if misdirected. While this reading moves well into fable, it illustrates how the distinctive and unique details of the Quran lend themselves to interpretive elaboration. In the same way that Joseph's brothers were jealous of the attention their father heaped upon him, the attention of the women is taken as the attractiveness of divine favor. Joseph is loved and desired because he is close to God. While such love may induce jealousy in others, we can read this narrative as a subtle but clever argument for how God's favor enlivens those it touches. Joseph is ever mindful that his powers and fortune are due to God's grace and mercy, and even his captivity in Egypt becomes a mechanism for the realization of God's will and the saving of his family from famine. Finally, I wish to turn to another figure loved by humans and God alike, Jesus. To appreciate the Quranic Jesus, it's worth first taking a minute to remember the religious milieu into which the Quran was introduced at the start of the 7th century. I've already noted that both Jews and Christians had a presence in the world of Muhammad prior to the revelation, although the extent of that presence is hotly debated. Certainly, Jewish tribes were present in the Arabian Peninsula and were part of the merchant economy in which Muhammad himself worked. Christians had strong footholds just across the Red Sea in Abyssinia, what today forms parts of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Sudan. It is also possible that early Christian ascetics, by reputation if not close contact, were also part of the picture. The presence of these communities gives us some perspective on why the Quran depicts Jesus as it does. The Jesus of the Quran is in conversation with these other and oftentimes competing representations of Jesus. As Tarif Khalidi, in his wonderful book, The Muslim Jesus, writes, "A close reading of the Quran would, I think, convey the impression of a text revealed in an environment of argument and counter-argument, of a text struggling to establish its authority amid the sneers and sarcasm of unbelievers or the babble of quarrelsome religious communities." Of course, Muhammad's message becomes one of the voices in that quarrelsome religious community. But it's also important to note that these communities were not the same as they are today. Remember, the creeds and doctrines decided upon by the various early church councils had not yet been widely enforced. What becomes Christian orthodoxy was in no sense firmly established. It's highly likely that even among Arabian Christians, diverse and often contentious depictions of Jesus were the norm. Muhammad's revelation was but one more voice in an already complicated and competing religious narrative. So, what does the Quran have to say about Jesus? First, he is called Isa ibn Maryam, literally Jesus, son of Mary, with the reference to his mother being the rule rather than the exception. Nearly every mention of Jesus includes this full name, an insistence on his matrilineal descent. It's worth adding that Arab names routinely use ibn as a means to indicate lineage, but this device is almost always patrilineal. The reference to Mary in Jesus' name is thus subversive of custom. Additionally, Mary has a chapter of the Quran named after her, and she figures prominently in the passages about Jesus. This includes acceptance of a virgin birth. According to Surah 3, Mary asks, "My Lord, how can I have a son when no man has touched me?" The angel said, "This is how God creates what he will. When he has ordained something, he only says be, and it is." We'll return to Mary's role and the nature of Jesus' conception shortly. but there are a few important details about Jesus to note. First, Jesus is referenced in 93 different verses in the Quran, more than Abraham and second only to Moses. It would be difficult then to overstate his prominence in both the Quranic and Muslim imagination. Second, the titles attached to Jesus are compelling and informative. Among other things, Jesus is called the Spirit and Word of God, as well as the seal of the Israelite prophets. This last title is taken to mean that, while Muhammad comes to be considered the seal of all prophets, Jesus was the final word for the Jewish community. Most enticingly, Jesus is consistently referred to as the Messiah. This word requires some further examination, which we'll get to in a moment. Finally, as a point of contrast, Jesus is definitively not crucified in the Quranic account, nor is he considered divine by any measure. According to Surah 4, they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, though it was made to appear like that to them. Those that disagreed about him are full of doubt, with no knowledge to follow, only supposition. They certainly did not kill him, no. God raised him up to himself. God is almighty and wise. There is not one of the people of the book who will not believe in Jesus before his death, and on the day of resurrection he will be a witness against them. This is a complicated passage, to be sure, and casts aspersions on both the Jews who were said not to accept the prophetic message of Jesus, as well as those Christians who elevated Jesus too high to the status of the divine. In a sense, the Quran seeks to resituate Jesus between the two poles of typical Jewish and Christian interpretation. Here, Jesus is a prophet, nothing more, but certainly nothing less. Perhaps it's best to assert something rather simple. Muslims love Jesus. A lot. In terms of Quranic reference, Jesus looms larger than Abraham, David, and at least textually, more even than Muhammad himself. And when Jesus is discussed, he's often described in ways that would be very familiar to Christians. He is called both the Son of the Virgin Mary and the Messiah. Let's pause here for just a moment. First, as the Son of Mary, the Quran affirms Christian teachings about the miracle surrounding Jesus' birth. But it also dispenses with the Son of Man and Son of God terms. While his birth to a virgin was clearly a miracle, the Quran does not take that miracle to imply some kind of divine identity for Jesus. Indeed, the Quran's position is that Christians made a mistake in thinking that Jesus was also God. Who does the Quran say Jesus was? The Son of the Virgin, but explicitly not the Son of God. To return to Surah 3, the angels said, "Mary, God gives you news of a word from him whose name will be the Messiah, Jesus, Son of Mary, who will be held in honor in this world and the next, who will be one of those brought near to God. He will speak to people in his infancy and in his adulthood. He will be one of the righteous." This passage clearly labels Jesus as the Word and Messiah, honors him with proximity to the divine, and forecasts his miracles and prophetic character. A few lines later, Surah 3 continues, "We relate to you this revelation, a decisive statement. In God's eyes, Jesus is just like Adam. He created him from dust, said to him, 'Be,' and he was. This is the truth from your Lord, so do not be one of those who doubt. This is the truth of the matter. There is no God but God. God is the exalted, the decider. If they turn away, God is well aware of anyone who causes corruption. Say, people of the book, let us arrive at a statement that is common to us all. We worship God alone. We ascribe no partner to him, and none of us takes others beside God as lords. If they turn away, say, "Witness our devotion to him." Taken cumulatively, these passages represent an attempt to navigate those quarrelsome communities depicted by Tarif Khalidi. Jesus is described using many of the terms most dear to Christian conceptions of him, but his possible divinity is rejected outright. This threading of the theological needle is then presented as a means to arrive at a statement that is common to us all: we worship God alone. In this quest for a middle ground regarding Jesus' nature, some of the titles and descriptions afforded him are worth examining. First, the title of Messiah. Technically, the word Messiah in Hebrew simply means anointed, and was usually reserved for those people chosen to be king. In the Hebrew Bible, this includes Cyrus the Great, but most famously David. Jesus was never a king, at least not in the ordinary sense of the word, and so the Messiah of the Quran must imply something else. Here we get into interesting territory. Like Christianity, Islamic tradition holds that Jesus will be the Messiah who comes at the end of days, a salvational figure, who will eventually sit on a throne in Jerusalem, where he will serve as a universal judge, after which time itself will end. This is the Jesus of divine kingship, although a king of justice rather than armies and territory, and is the sense of Messiah most familiar to Christians, Messiah as Christ. As we'll see momentarily, the Islamic account rejects the extent to which Christianity transformed Messiah from earthly king to the king, God alone. This association is too much for the Quran. Thus, when Jesus is described as Messiah in the Quran, it is in different and other ways. For example, he is also often described using a very particular term, Ruh Allah, the Spirit of God. Surah 66 describes his conception. So we breathed into her from our spirit. It is this last term, Jesus as the Spirit of God, that I want to turn to next. The Arabic word for spirit, ruh, is related to the Hebrew word ruach, meaning spirit, but also breath or wind. Most famously, when God creates Adam out of the dust in Genesis 2, he animates this lifeless clod by breathing into him his ruach, his spirit. Thus Adam, which incidentally in Hebrew means simply earth or dirt, is given life by the breath of God. Jesus for Muslims is that same breath or spirit of God. In some sense, Jesus is presented to us as a new Adam, a new first man. Both Adam and Jesus are animated by the Spirit of God, but Jesus is said to have been strengthened by this breath of God. I think it is this sense, Isa ibn Maryam, Ruh Allah, Jesus, son of Mary, the Spirit of God, that defines how Messiah is understood in the Quranic text. Finally, I must note the biggest point of disagreement between Christian and Muslim views of Jesus. While the traditional Christian position holds that Jesus, God incarnate, is crucified, dies upon the cross, is buried, and then rises again on the third day, the Islamic tradition holds that Jesus did not die upon the cross. Instead, like Elisha before him, the Quran tells us that Jesus is taken up into heaven and that the body upon the cross was a substitute, only an appearance of death. Jesus himself did not die. This lack of death, this mortal elevation to heaven, allows for Jesus to return again as judge of the apocalypse, at least according to the hagiographies of the prophets that followed the Quran. Again and again in the text, Christians are castigated for mistaking Jesus for God. The Quran explicitly rejects the Trinity or any other association with the divine. It is this error, above all else, that the Quran finds in Christian doctrine. All of this matters for two reasons. First, such an association between a man, even one as remarkable as Jesus, and God, borders on a kind of idolatry in Islamic tradition. Second, to make someone or something equal with God is to lessen the divine. In other words, the Quran does not desacralize Jesus because it's opposed to him, quite the contrary. But the Quran does wish to limit the association so as not to sully God's oneness, what the text calls tawheed. Making Jesus a man, even one called the Spirit of God, is done so to preserve God's nature. We could continue to explore the broader Islamic conception of Noah, Joseph, and Jesus, the way later interpreters and poets expand on the subtle hints in the Quranic text. In addition to his role in Judgment Day, Jesus is also often held up as the model ascetic, and thus becomes a favorite of the mystical branch of Islam, the Sufis. The Sufis, too, make Zuleika a saint, a model for divine yearning. Mary's story also deserves more attention, as there is scarcely a mention of Jesus that doesn't include her. The descriptions of Isa ibn Maryam most clearly underscore the human birth of Jesus. That is, despite his miraculous conception at God's command, he is still the son of a woman. It is little accident that Mary alone of all women has an entire chapter of the Quran named after her. Leaving you with these hints, I hope, inspires further investigation into the text and its literary afterlife. For the Quran itself, however, the message could not be clearer. God is alone, unique, powerful, both judgmental and merciful, wily and loving. Whatever adjectives we use for God, however, one is the operative principle. There is only one God, and no family, lover, or individual can compare.